some things are better left unsaid. Subtext, you know?
5 minutes into the second season of Sam Esmail's acclaimed TV show Mr. Robot, we resume the story of schizophrenic hacker Elliot Alderson with a series of close-ups on this, a notebook titled Red Wheelbarrow. The notebook comes up again and again throughout the season, eventually giving way to more and more references to red wheelbarrows besides the notebook, including a barbecue restaurant and a poem recital by Tyrell. So what's with all the red wheelbarrows? Let's get into it. First, we should summarize where and when the red wheelbarrows come up. This is as good a point as any to say that this video will spoil the entirety of seasons 1 and 2 of the show, as well as some major elements of 3 and 4. Basically, go watch the show first, not just so you can watch this video, but because it's one of the best shows ever made. Also, I'll be referring to the mastermind personality as Elliot, because it just makes more sense to do so, and the collective group of personalities also as Elliot, so apologies if that gets confusing down the line. But let's get into the wheelbarrows. At this point in the story, chronologically speaking, we're several months on from the 5/9 hack, in which the hacker group F Society, led by Elliot, encrypted the financial data of E Corp, the world's largest conglomerate, crippling the US economy and kickstarting a financial crisis. Elliot has no recollection of the night of the hack, as his alternate personality Mr. Robot was in control at the time. He's still reeling from the fact that Mr. Robot is A, based upon his deceased father who died of cancer when he was a child, B, an aspect of Elliot's split personality that he's been hallucinating the whole time, C, able to take control of Elliot's body, often against his will, and D, withheld all of this information from Elliot for most of the first season. Naturally, there's a deficit of trust in their relationship, and Elliot believes that Mr. Robot is a dangerous extremist who's actively attempting to take full control over their body and banish Elliot to the recesses of their mind. Fearing what he and/or Mr. Robot is capable of, Elliot allows himself to be jailed for an unrelated dog theft in order to cut himself off from technology. While in prison, he meets Leon, a guy who smuggles items into the prison and sells them, as well as secretly a member of the Chinese hacker group Dark Army who assisted Elliot with the hack. Leon is assigned to keep an eye on Elliot in prison and offers him guidance on how to cope with the experience, mainly around creating structure and routine. Seemingly inspired, Elliot creates a mental space where he imagines himself living with his abusive mother rather than in prison. More importantly, he asks Leon to get him a notebook. Titling it Red Wheelbarrow, Elliot uses it constantly as a journal, recording his thoughts and feelings, taking note of the time so he can see where he loses time and Mr. Robot could perhaps be taking over. He's keeping himself to a strict regimen of control, refusing to lose focus or put himself in a situation that Mr. Robot could take advantage of. As a side note, I got the Peripheral book, which is a full account of Elliot's journaling rather than just the snippets we get in the show. Yeah, they made a full copy of Elliot's ramblings and I am absolutely the kind of stan who would buy it. The journal covers the couple of months from Elliot entering prison to the day he hands it off to pyromaniac prisoner Hot Carla to burn. It details his struggles against the other inmates, which isn't really relevant here, his struggle against his own egoism and toxic masculinity, which is slightly more relevant, and his struggle against Mr. Robot for control, which is very relevant. It details how Elliot has completely cut Mr. Robot off, as well as us the audience, his other imaginary friend, due to us not telling him that Mr. Robot wasn't real, which to be fair is our bad. Instead, he speaks to us via the journal, with regular interruptions from Mr. Robot when he's not sulking or scheming, and so they've seemingly stayed for a number of weeks, with Mr. Robot angry and frustrated at Elliot hobbling them and wasting the potential opportunities they're missing out of in the wake of the hack, and Elliot distancing himself from everyone but his therapist Krista and occasional visitors as he attempts to get a handle on his own mind. In the journal, he describes what he sees and hears Mr. Robot doing, including shooting him in the head repeatedly. He describes that he used to panic when Mr. Robot would get hostile, but has now settled into a calm resistance of his antics. This is again expanded upon in the tie-in book. Realizing that Mr. Robot has been hijacking their body while Elliot is asleep, Elliot takes just a shit ton of Adderall in a desperate bid to get rid of him. Shortly after, Elliot is abducted by mysterious agents who mix concrete in a red wheelbarrow and force it down his throat. Jump back to reality because psych, this is all an imaginary construct of Mr. Robot's. Welcome to the show, yes, it's all like this. He's actually taken control of Elliot's body and forced him to throw up the pills. Defiant, Elliot re-swallows the pills, which I'm not going to show you because I'm not a terrorist, and his mental state steadily slowly declines as he goes without sleep for around a week, while his mind is frazzled by the drug in one of the best sequences in television history. During this time, his writing in the journal becomes completely incomprehensible, with most of the words having jumbled up letters, before becoming the handwritten equivalent of keyboard smashing, and finally writing out the code for a kernel panic. After Elliot accidentally says his internal monologue out loud rather than posting it on an atheism subreddit, he chucks the journal in the bin, but it's rescued by the prison chaplain and handed back to him by Ray, the warden. Ray tells him that control is an illusion, and that bottling up Mr. Robot is only a temporary and ineffective solution. He encourages Elliot to confront his issues head-on and talk to Mr. Robot until they work it out. Then there's pretty much no mention of the journal or Red Wheelbarrows until episode 7, where Elliot has Carla burn the journal, and the titles of episode 9 play over the remaining burnt corner of the book, after we've been given the truth about Elliot's imprisonment. Later, Elliot attempts to lucid dream so that he can observe Mr. Robot, and we see him decoding a cipher written on a menu for none other than Red Wheelbarrow Barbecue. We would find out further down the line that the restaurant is a front, and actually the base of operations of Phase 2 of the plan Elliot and the Dark Armies concocted for the hack. But for now, confusion! Finally, in the series finale, we flash back to an earlier meeting between Tyrell and Mr. Robot during Season 1, only this time filmed as Elliot, which is pretty neat. There's the conversation we've already seen, in which Tyrell asks to be more involved in the hack, and Mr. Robot insists on keeping their relationship distant. But this time, the scene carries on. A desperate Tyrell tells Mr. Robot he believes they have a connection, but he only gets the response,
"You're only seeing what's in front of you. You're not seeing what's above you."
Tyrell still doesn't understand and quotes the poem The Red Wheelbarrow by William Carlos Williams, explaining that it was a poem that meant very much to his father, and he continues to remember it as a reminder to never become like him, something that seems to resonate with Mr. Robot or Elliot. After this season, we get a whole bunch of screen time in the Red Wheelbarrow Barbecue, as well as confirmation that it was Elliot who suggested it as the codename for Stage 2, but that's pretty much it as far as occurrences go. So what's the deal? Well, there's several different deals, both within the show's internal canon and looking down on it from above on a more analytical basis. Let's start off with the easiest to explain, what the Red Wheelbarrow means to Tyrell and Elliot.
Why did you start writing a journal in the first place?
I thought it was the right answer.
The right answer to what?
Controlling my life.
First things first, we're gonna have to put the actual poem to the side for now, because to these two characters, the content of the poem is irrelevant. Tyrell states that his father didn't speak a lick of English besides that, perhaps not even understanding the meaning of the words themselves. As a result of his hatred, either he never bothered to consider why his father obsessed over it, or its personal meaning to Tyrell overrode any other interpretation either his father or anyone else had of the work. Elliot goes for largely the same approach, being more inspired by what the poem meant symbolically to Tyrell rather than the poem's actual intent or historical context, that being their relationships with their fathers. Essentially, the poem and its contents don't really matter, it's what it signifies for the two of them, which Tyrell states pretty plainly.
I use it as a reminder. A reminder of him, and a reminder of what I never want to become.
We don't know much about Tyrell's past, and won't for the entire show. We won't even understand him much as a person until a couple of key episodes in seasons 3 and 4. All we have to go on is this line, which tells us that Tyrell's relationship with his father was fraught, and he's got oodles of unresolved baggage there. That idea is reinforced when Vizzini interrogates him, but it's not expanded upon. It's a total assumption on my part, so I won't base any of my conclusions on it, but I fully believe that Tyrell was abused by his father, though not necessarily in the same way as Elliot. It would go a long way in explaining the root of his own far from stellar mental health. But it's best not to make assumptions and work with what we actually have, which is issues with their fathers. Tyrell is speaking to the Mr. Robot personality here, who seems to respect Tyrell's intelligence and nothing else about him.
We might just want the same thing, and I need to be involved.
I'm pretty positive you're dead wrong about that, my friend. I don't think there's anything we could possibly agree on.
But this is also the only personality who fully knows the extent of Elliot's abuse as a child. Tyrell and Elliot's relationship completely changes after this moment, and the thing that brings Mr. Robot around on Tyrell is empathy for his parental trauma. It turns out they could agree on one thing: they hate their fathers. So that's as far as Tyrell and Mr. Robot relate to the poem, but Elliot isn't even present for this conversation. So how does the Red Wheelbarrow come to affect him?
You want me to tell you that I see my dead father? That I don't know how to control this thing?
Elliot finds himself in court for stealing Flipper and hacking Hansen, and realizing that he's not even close to being in control of himself and his actions, and that Mr. Robot can be doing anything at all with their body without him even being aware of it, he deliberately gets himself sentenced to 18 months in prison. Elliot wants to use this time to regain control of himself, of his disparate personalities. He wants to cut himself, and by extension Mr. Robot, off from technology so they can't hack anyone. In prison, they can't hurt anyone on the outside, and Elliot can focus on putting the broken pieces of his mind back together. When he meets Leon and gets the idea of surviving through routine, he decides on a notebook so that he can record any time he loses to Mr. Robot and get a better understanding of his mental state.
That's what the control, the regimen, the journal, my perfectly constructed loop, what this whole thing's been about.
It seems that even though Elliot isn't consciously aware of the conversation between Tyrell and Mr. Robot, parts of it have bled through subconsciously, because he chooses to name the journal Red Wheelbarrow. I also believe that the feeling Mr. Robot associated with the poem also carried over, because Elliot uses it in a similar way. See, Elliot has a limited understanding of what role Mr. Robot actually plays in his mind.
He'll try to wear us down, but as long as we stick to the regimen, he can't take control. No matter how much of an illusion he thinks this is.
At this point in the story, he isn't aware that Mr. Robot is a protector, someone that takes over when pain is about to be inflicted on Elliot, so that he doesn't have to feel it, originally manifesting as a way to cope with his parental abuse. Hey, who put these Moon Knight clips here? Instead, Elliot thinks of Mr. Robot as an extension of his father, not least because he looks just like him. More than the physical resemblance, he associates him with the pain his father caused him, both of them hurting him by throwing him off a pier and out a window, although not really, and both of them lying to him about his true identity and the cancer respectively. He doesn't consciously know about being molested yet, but given the other instances of unconscious feeling in the show, I wouldn't be surprised if that also played a part. That relationship is also bundled up with complicated feelings about religion, partly influenced by his outlook on the world,
exclusive groups created to manage control,
partly by his relationship with his mother, and the messiah complex inherent to the mastermind personality.
Sometimes I dream of saving the world.
He even capitalizes Mr. Robot's pronouns in the journal, as if he were some wrathful deity, another aspect of the classical father figure sky god with grand plans for his son. The rift between Elliot and Mr. Robot is never wider than this time. Elliot thinks of him as a competing, antagonistic force that wants to remove Elliot from the equation entirely and take control of their body. He's wrong, of course, but at this point he doesn't know that. That's the main issue for Elliot. Control.
Saving everyone from the invisible hand, the one that controls us every day without us knowing it.
He doesn't just want control of his present, he wants control over determining his future. He doesn't want to become Mr. Robot, and he doesn't want to become his father. You could even argue that the entire mastermind persona manifests due to a feeling of powerlessness and loss of control when he trashes the server room his old colleagues lock him in, later coalescing into the concrete identity of a hacker vigilante when he considers his powerlessness in the wider context of modern society. An alternate personality who can take over his body and block his memories is just about the most invasive, controlling thing Elliot could imagine, so he's here in prison, keeping this journal in order to regain that control. He repeatedly writes "I am in control" in the journal, like a mantra. The journal also serves as a means of regaining control from us, the audience, his imaginary friend. After the reveal that Darlene is his sister, and shortly before the false reveal that Mr. Robot is his father, he confronts us, asking us if we knew, a kind of cheeky fourth wall break about perceptive viewers and fans theorizing on subreddits. Elliot doesn't trust us anymore for keeping secrets from him, just like Mr. Robot, so he's actively deceiving us by making it look like he's at his mother's house as opposed to prison. This part is all confirmed by Elliot in the show itself when the curtain falls.
Control can sometimes be an illusion, but sometimes you need illusion to gain control.
But I'd go even further and say that releasing the journal as a tie-in book also plays into that narrative of control. And this one is a bit of a stretch, but I find it funny. Elliot keeps the contents of the journal from us, all his inner thoughts of the time before the season started, so much that it's not even in the show, and you need to read them rather than watch them or hear them. He cuts us off so thoroughly that we need to turn to another medium entirely to find out what he's thinking. Like I said, it's a stretch, but I like it. Mr. Robot repeatedly mocks and twists Elliot's attempt at gaining dominance and separating or destroying the other, the most memorable of these involving a red wheelbarrow. When Elliot takes the Adderall to prevent himself from sleeping, Mr. Robot makes him hallucinate being kidnapped by the anonymous agents he's been paranoid about since the first episode. They mix concrete in a red wheelbarrow and pour it down his throat, before revealing that it's an illusion created by Mr. Robot, who's busy making them puke up the pills.
But ODing on Adderall was finally my way of controlling him.
He's angry at the extreme actions Elliot is taking, and on the offensive, as well as frustrated that Elliot doesn't seem to understand the nature of their shared mind. They're the same person. Whatever defense mechanisms Elliot uses are equally able to be wielded as weapons by Mr. Robot. If Elliot wants to use a red wheelbarrow to stay focused and grounded in reality, Mr. Robot will use it to blind him and make him question reality.
This control you think you have?
It's an illusion.
But he's not doing this maliciously. It's brutal, yes, but he's trying to make Elliot understand that they can't fight each other, and he expresses the same idea far more calmly in other moments. In the journal, he invites Elliot to draw circles within circles, interlinked and impossible to extricate, saying that this is what he and Elliot are. In the show, there's the chess game, where they impossibly end in stalemate over and over again, with Mr. Robot making the point that they can't outwit or outmaneuver the other, because it's the same person making the moves. His most tender moment is actually one in which Mr. Robot forcibly takes control, placing Elliot in a fake sitcom world. Elliot assumes that this is Mr. Robot permanently taking over their body, but he explains that the only reason he took over was to bear the pain of the beating Ray's thugs gave him, so that Elliot wouldn't have to. It's this realization, that all of Elliot's efforts to rid himself of Mr. Robot are futile, and that despite the conflict with Ray being all his own doing, Mr. Robot still took the beating for him, that prompt Elliot to burn the journal. He doesn't need to cut off and compartmentalize the two of them anymore. They can communicate openly. Ultimately, Elliot paradoxically regains control by letting go of the need for ultimate control.
Control is about as real as a one-legged unicorn taking a leak at the end of a double rainbow.
He and Mr. Robot are the same person and they can coexist. It becomes about openness and honesty in their relationship, accepting that they both want what's best for Elliot, but they may want to go about it in different ways. His resolution with his real father is another couple of seasons away, and at the end of this one, he'll find himself back on the outside, interacting with technology, the victim of Mr. Robot's manipulations, and surrounded once again with terrible influences, and Elliot will slide back into old patterns, as he has done and will do so often in the show.
It's time to finally take back control.
And now it's time for you to give that control back to the host.
But for now, he and Mr. Robot are cool. So in universe, it's pretty clear why Elliot calls the journal Red Wheelbarrow, what that means to him, and why he abandons it before the end of the season. But as with all things in Mr. Robot, nothing is as simple as its surface level appearance, and to figure the deeper stuff out, we need to look at the poem itself.
So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow, glazed with rainwater, beside the white chickens.
The Red Wheelbarrow was published by American poet William Carlos Williams in 1923 in his collection of poetry, Spring and All. To really get into explaining the poem, we'll need to go over the wider context of Imagism and Modernism that led to Williams' creation. Imagism was an early 20th century literary movement born out of a rejection of the romantic stylings that had been in vogue for the last 100 years or so. As Modernism was sweeping across the West, making everything new and revolutionizing practically every aspect of society, poetry saw its own changes. In short, the small group of Imagist writers viewed Romanticism as rather waffly, actually obscuring the thing it was they were trying to express.
Why waste time? Say lot word when few word do trick.
You could summarize the ethos of Imagism in three main areas. Directness. The poem must directly address the thing that it's about. Abstract should be entirely avoided if possible, and definitely not mixed in with concrete concepts. Brevity. No word should be used that doesn't contribute to the whole, few word do trick. And free verse. There's no need to adhere to fixed meter, follow whatever form and rhythm works best for the poem. If you want a prime example of what kind of poetry these principles result in, look no further than Ezra Pound's poem In a Station of the Metro. The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. Yes, that's all of it, 14 words, so that's brevity checked off. Free verse is a win too, and the title of the poem actually seems like it's the first line, making it sound like a haiku but without the right number of syllables for it. And finally, directness. There are no abstracts in the poem, only the connection your mind makes between two concrete images, faces in a crowd and petals on a tree, and the inferences you make from them. It's quite amazing actually, how Pound creates an impression of motion and the passage of time without using a single verb. With just two images succinctly described, he establishes an idea of ephemerality, the delicate, inevitably dying petals paired with the ghost-like apparition of people at a train station, a place no one stays at, only coming or going. We'll come back to Pound a bit later to discuss his thoughts on colour, but for now, let's return to his friend and contemporary Williams and his own seminal imagist work. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens. The Red Wheelbarrow is probably one of the finest examples of the imagist style. It adheres to the same general rules we established earlier, embodying directness, brevity, and a free verse, but I'd argue that it's elevated beyond many of its peers through some clever and insightful techniques employed by Williams. I find the poem's premise a little funny because Williams basically created the ultimate academic poem simply by saying, "so much depends." It prompts an inquiry from the reader, that being, why does so much depend on this red wheelbarrow? The poem's text doesn't explicitly explain it, so you're required to analyze it. I know plenty of bored and frustrated students who saw this as everything despicable about modern art. But why does so much depend on a red wheelbarrow? It's been sarcastically said that a wheelbarrow is a useful thing to have around what is presumably a farm, given the chickens. Others have tried to dig into Williams's own past and experiences to determine why a red wheelbarrow might have significance to him personally. I find that route of inquiry to be missing the point. Perhaps this was a real image that Williams saw and sought to capture, and perhaps it carries personal meaning to him. But the importance conveyed to the reader doesn't come from that context. It comes solely from the literary techniques Williams employed. The red wheelbarrow matters because Williams said it matters, and then he made you feel like it matters. Formatting is a huge part of why it's so successful at what it does. Not to say that the poem can't ever be as good when read aloud, but the way it's written informs the way it's intended to be thought or spoken. For instance, let's leave the actual content of the poem intact, but change a few things. So much depends upon a wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the chickens. I think you'd agree that reading that carries a fraction of the weight of Williams's original formatting. Now let's add everything back in that we took away, starting with the colours. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens. It's surprising how much more concrete the image is in your mind when you add a simple colour. You consciously know the outline and characteristics of a wheelbarrow and a chicken, but the colour gives them a shape and contrast that makes them far more distinct. The mere fact of a choice, that out of the very few words he has, Williams is telling you the wheelbarrow is red, seems to imply that the red must matter somehow. The effect is undoubtedly changed if you call it a crimson wheelbarrow, or the ivory chickens, for instance, I believe for the worse. Next, let's restore the heavy use of enjambment, that is, continuing a sentence beyond the end of a line or stanza. Now we've separated the poem into an introduction and 3 images, making them feel more distinct from one another as opposed to the visual soup we had before. Williams goes even further though, moving upon and chickens to a new line, and splitting these two compound nouns, wheelbarrow and rainwater, into individual words on a new line. The effect it has is making you hang on to nearly every morpheme, ascribing them with an importance they don't inherently possess. Rainwater is ordinary. The rainwater glazing this wheelbarrow is significant. Wheelbarrows are unremarkable. This red wheelbarrow is apparently remarkable enough to inspire half a movement and a deep reference in a primetime TV show. The focus is so intense that the word glazed feels so packed with meaning and aesthetic value where it might have gone unnoticed in another work. It also gives the poem a kind of prayer-like rhythm, following a pattern of 3 words, 1 word for every stanza with a similar number of syllables. The only modifiers present in the poem are colours, namely red and white, so they stand out starkly in your mind. We'll get into the colours a bit later, but for now the overall brevity and lack of other adjectives make these ones stand out, much like the black bough in Pound's poem. So if you had to come up with a broad, summary statement about what the poem's meaning is, it would be this. The red wheelbarrow only matters because Williams told you it matters. What it meant to Williams is a curiosity for sure, but far from the point. Otherwise the poem would have been about that. He made it matter to the reader through a combination of word choice, syntax, grammar, and formatting. The result is a poem that is less a piece with its own internal narrative or contextual explanation, and more of a statement on the power of language and its formatting. A thesis statement and proof of concept, if you will. There's one more instance of poetry that it would be worth bringing up here, and it's penned by Elliot himself. In the full journal, that tie-in book I mentioned earlier, he writes a poem for Carla based on some advice in a book. What he comes up with resembles the red wheelbarrow on a surface level. So my day unfurled, and red was bountiful, grasping with rare women before they wilt, crying. The physical shape of the poem is the same, with 4 stanzas, each 2 lines and 3 in 1 word respectively. The first letter of each word in the poem is also the same as the first letters in the original poem, which is pretty neat. But it's not real imagism. It's almost the complete opposite, being comprised entirely of abstracts like rare wilting women, rather than concrete images like red wheelbarrows. Like I said before, the original poem itself means very little to Elliot, just like how wheelbarrows mean very little to him, even though he draws them constantly throughout the journal. I interpret this as Elliot's subconscious peeking through his conscious thoughts. He's actively mulling on his habit of becoming unmoored from reality, clinging to women he finds interesting in order to cope, and hurting them as a result of his privacy-invading ways. But amongst that, he's subconsciously thinking about the poem, and how this kind of introspection is part of his attempt at regaining control and checking some of his more destructive behaviors. But one other thing in Elliot's poem stands out to me, and that's red was bountiful. Because if we're talking about season 2, red really is bountiful. I'm gonna open this section with a quote from Ezra Pound's 1934 book, ABC of Reading, because it bridges the imagism and color red sections just so nicely. He's talking about the ideogrammic method, a technique he uses for creating abstracts by using concrete images, inspired by how some Chinese characters are put together as compound ideograms. For instance, the characters for tree and sun are combined to make east, representing the sun shining through the tree branches at sunrise. Pound explains his rationale like so. In Europe, if you ask a man to define anything, his definition always moves away from the simple things that he knows perfectly well. It recedes into an unknown region, that is, a region of remoter and progressively remoter abstractions. Thus, if you ask him what red is, he says it is a color. If you ask him what a color is, he tells you it is a vibration, or a refraction of light, or a division of the spectrum. And if you ask him what vibration is, he tells you it is a mode of energy, or something of that sort, until you arrive at a modality of being or non-being, or at any rate you get in beyond your depth, and beyond his depth. Pound then goes on to describe how many Chinese characters are ideograms, more images of the very thing they're representing, using that east combination I mentioned earlier as an example. They are the thing itself, rather than a representation of spoken language referring to the thing. He goes on to say, but when he wanted to make a picture of something more complicated, or of a general idea, how did he go about it? He is to define red. How can he do it in a picture that isn't painted in red paint? He puts together the abbreviated pictures of rose, iron rust, cherry, flamingo. So my girlfriend thinks that's a tragic selection of things to create the concept of the color red in someone's mind, and proposes instead blood, strawberry, ruby, and rose, which I 100% agree makes more sense. Cherries and roses are okay, I guess, but rust is like an orange, and flamingos are pink, so I don't know why he went straight to those. I get that he's going for a range of reddish shades, but that's stupid. Pound is stupid. Either way, the point I'm trying to make here is that associations are important. Just go watch my video on the colors in John Wick. Scenes in Mr. Robot usually have an extremely monochromatic palette, both in the physical sets and props, and in the color grading in editing. Most of the time, scenes are composed of brilliant whites or thick shadows, with a wealth of greys blurring into one another. Or you'll get scenes flooded with neutral yellows, oranges, and browns that form a kind of messy sameness. Where there is a bright color existing in the frame, it's often something so commonplace as the bright green of tree leaves that it doesn't stand out in the image. Other bright colors, like the neon lights of the arcade, can be said to function the same way. They're just the colors that things actually are without being that deep. But on the other hand, it does stand in stark contrast with the drab rest of the world, almost as if this is one of the few places where the hacker Q are really living life. But the location is hardly ever seen in season 2, so we won't discuss that much here. Being a show primarily about hackers and the way we engage with technology, characters are frequently awash with the glare of screens from their phones, computers, or TVs, often providing the only light source in the scene. This serves to further mute the colors or cover everything in a pale blue hue, so pale it could almost not be discerned as blue without a direct comparison, as well as to sharpen and lengthen shadows. It's because of this trend of incredibly muted colors that every occurrence of one color immediately stands out: red. There are plenty of instances, mostly through the point of view of Elliot, Dom, and Joanna, It's only Red that sees this level of consistent recurrence. If you come through looking for other distinct colours, you only get 1 or 2 instances of each, like Price's yellow tie or the purple wall Elliot walks past. Red, though, is everywhere, and not least in the titles of the show itself. I'm also certain the colour of objects throughout have been edited in post to make the reds brighter and the other colours desaturated to heighten the contrast. So why go to all the trouble? What's the point of all the red? Possibly more than any other colour, red grabs your attention. It's no coincidence that stop signs, red cards, and notification icons look the way they do. The colour has numerous strong connotations for people, influenced by psychology, history, politics, and a likely endless list of factors that are continuously being added to. Don't worry, I'm not going to get into linking Mr. Robot with anarcho-communism or the blood of Christ. I could.
Jesus fucking Christ!
I absolutely could.
All of the money White Rose and her cronies have been stealing for decades just went back to the people.
But I won't. Rather, the way red is highlighted in Season 2 can be grouped into 3 main sections: sexuality, danger, and focus. Red is closely associated with passion, particularly love and sex. Think of the Red Light District, the Scarlet Letter, and classic red-lipped movie seductresses. Joanna pretty much dominates this category. Unsurprising given that she often wields her sexuality as a means of manipulating the people around her. We see red come up in her bondage gear, like the wrist ties Derek restrains her with. When she approaches Elliot to ask him to trace the phone she's receiving calls from, she paints her nails and lips a bright red shade and proceeds to act seductively towards him. Or threateningly. Or both. Which leads us to danger. Passion manifests in other ways besides love and lust, like violence and anger. Besides the copious amounts of blood from the various murders and injuries throughout the show, red is used to emphasize a present threat or indicate incoming danger. For instance, Joanna has red paint thrown at her by the protester outside her house. Elliot passes a man in a red top and under some red scaffolding when he's jumped by the neo-Nazis, and Angela's picked up by the Dark Army in a red van. The scene in which Gideon is murdered sees him in a bar surrounded by red lights, which comes up again during the Dark Army attack in China. Often, red things will switch from a romantic subtext to a threatening one. There's Joanna's whole deal, which we mentioned before, but also the gifts she receives from Scott, wrapped in bright red ribbons. She initially believes them to be gifts from Tyrell out of love for her and their child, but it's eventually revealed to be more sinister presents from Scott sent out of grief, which quickly turns into violent rage. Probably the pinnacle of this comes at the end of episode 10, when Darlene and Cisco are at the diner, completely bathed in red light. They're having fun, relaxing, and making lovey eyes at each other, but as Dom and the Dark Army figure out where they are, the tension builds and builds until the red light becomes oppressive, like a warning light blaring at them to get out of there. Of course, they don't, and the tension erupts again into violence. But while we could ascribe numerous meanings to the various uses of red throughout the show, the single thing unifying them is that your attention was drawn to them. Red is practically the only color used to make something in a scene pop. Blue is notable, but that's something I'll leave to a bonus video for patrons. In the first episode alone, as we're introduced to Elliot's new routine and unknowingly being introduced to key parts of the prison, several items stand out for their red color. The most notable of these would be the phone, which is frequently used throughout the first half of the season. There's also the red drying rack, which Elliot will begin to use obsessively as he washes plates during his Adderall binge, as well as the red curtains and red pencil holder in Elliot's room. The diner takes the cake with the red cups, red walls, and red door. Specific things like the apple Mr. Robot eats also pop out and demand your attention. It's a bitter shame that the pills Elliot takes aren't red, given the overt Matrix references that the first season of the show loved to make. Maybe they wanted to distance themselves from the idea that the show was a derivative pastiche of Fight Club and the Matrix, which if we're talking the first season alone is 100% valid and acknowledged by Esmail. They are a pale orange, so you could call it as close to red as you really get in real life with powdered drugs, but then the red pill is also the one that wakes you up and shows you the truth, while the Adderall actually obscures reality for Elliot, so that doesn't make sense. But maybe in his head it is clarity? I'm going off on a tangent here. While we're here in Tangentville, it's meaningless, but still a little funny. Elliot gets his notebook from Leon, a character who fills the exact same prison role as Morgan Freeman's character in Shawshank Redemption, the guy in prison who can get you anything, whose name is, of course, Red. Anyway, the Adderall scene is a big eye-opener for how red represents Elliot's pure, unwavering focus. He talks about how focused the drug is making him as a plus, something that's a real problem for him in the rest of his time in prison. His focus on reality, on concrete things he knows for sure to exist, is what he's relying on to keep Mr. Robot from taking over and losing time as a result. In the companion book, Elliot talks about focusing on the basketball games to avoid Mr. Robot, something the show also spends a heck of a lot of time on, as he watches the red basketball hoop. That's just just one of the obsessive routines he establishes in order to maintain control. Every step of his life is planned out, tightly controlled and monitored, and any deviations are eliminated if possible. But he always feels the temptation to shift his focus elsewhere, from characters like Ray, who, it should be noted, typically wears blue. In short, red becomes a visual shorthand for Elliot's new approach of singular focus. In his mind, objects or places that occupy his attention are highlighted with red. It's as if his focus is so intense and unwavering that it's literally highlighting things in the scene, like a video game's detective vision. Production-wise, none of these things needed to be red. It was a deliberate choice to make them red. In fact, when the illusion slips away, signaled by a red light I might add, and we see Elliot walking through the prison, recontextualizing all the prior scenes, the colors almost all return to the oranges and pale off-whites one might expect in a US prison, the same colors that have dominated the rest of the show. It's through this lens that I understand what the Red Wheelbarrow means to the show as a whole. Not its internal meaning to the characters and their stories, not its external meaning to William Carlos Williams and his readers, but how the Red Wheelbarrow serves as an ethos that permeates production on the entire season.
Goodbye, friend.
Season 2 is the one where Elliot takes a step back and critically examines himself. Too much, it turns out, or perhaps misguidedly. He's trying to figure out who he is, which is its own huge question because he wants to identify and separate the parts of himself that are Mr. Robot and fill in the gaps left by his taking control. He even goes to the lengths of putting himself in jail to cut himself off from the world so that he can divert all his prodigious mental capacity into self-control and self-discovery. He goes too far, of course, sinking deeper into himself this season than any other time except the brutal therapy episode with Vera and the finale. He sinks so deep into the self that he becomes solipsistic in the purest sense, convinced no one else exists but him, and you as the audience are right there along with him. I had more than a small belief that Elliot and Tyrell were the same person. The realities of how that wouldn't work be damned, until of course our shared delusion is violently brought to a halt. He also goes in whole hog with very little guidance, fueled by little more than hyperfocus and a dream, and ignoring Krista at every turn. While he stumbles into some small steps forward, like realizing that Mr. Robot's existence has a purpose that isn't antagonistic in nature, or that his casually crashing the economy might not have been the best move, he takes just as many steps laterally or backwards and gets himself even further into trouble than he ever was before. Why then would you not use as Elliot's emotional touchstone a poem that demands examination of the most minute details in order to reach understanding? Creator and showrunner Sam Esmail has talked many times before about how he loves building layers of subtext and symbolism into his show, and I do mean his show. The work of cinematographer Todd Campbell, composer Matt Quayle, and of course all the actors cannot be overstated. But at the end of the day, not many show creators want or get to have the level of control Esmail had on Mr. Robot. He goes in a bit more depth about the layers of obfuscation he puts in the show in this really fascinating interview with Vulture. In our show, reality becomes our subtext. So if you have a scene with two characters, one of them loves the other, it's more interesting for that person to hate the person on the surface, but subtextually you feel, oh, well that person actually loves them. And you sense that maybe, or maybe you don't, and then you're surprised when that comes out. Either way, there's another layer of engagement. It's a lot more interesting. If everybody is saying on-the-nose dialogue to each other, if everything is on the surface, that becomes less intriguing. That doesn't let me engage on it on a level that I think could be deeper and richer. We have this opportunity with our character, who's obviously narrating to us and considers us a friend, felt betrayed by us the first season. What if he feels like, well, I'm gonna lie back, I'm gonna withhold from you, and I'm not gonna tell you everything? I mean, I've not seen this done before, but now we're developing this weird relationship with the audience. Whether you saw the prison coming or not, that's not the point. The point is that you're now having this subtextual relationship with him that you didn't have in the first season. And then to add that now, under the unreliable narrator device, not only do we see it through his eyes, but he could also be lying to you. That's another storytelling device that we could throw in. Just as Elliot's mind is jumbled and confused, the secrets to his own self buried under lies and mysteries, Esmail presents us with a show that does the same. He deliberately hides the truth, even building the audience into the narrative so that Elliot can actively mistrust and mislead them. Instead of simply letting just the characters or the actor's performance tell us that Elliot is in hyperfocus, attempting to regain control of his mind through self-analysis, you could name his journal Red Wheelbarrow and let the audience figure it out from there. The Red Wheelbarrow is like a lure at the end of a line, placed by Esmail, designed to invite the audience to tease out the story at the heart of Mr. Robot. It's deliberate obfuscation, but not with the intent to hide everything, but to encourage you to actively think about every detail, to put you in the mindset of thinking like Esmail, in veiled layers of symbolism and abstraction, and he even went to the trouble to paint most of the markers bright red. In many ways, while the fourth and final season of Mr. Robot is one of my favourite seasons of television ever produced, I do feel as if there was a wane in this level of multi-layered complexity after season 2. This is pure speculation now, but I believe that's in part down to the initial reaction people had back in 2016. Season 2 was not met with the near universal praise upon release that the first season received. For many critics and viewers, it proved a deeply frustrating experience, with its many deceptive twists, abstract dialogue, and a general sense that it was unclear where the show was going. Season 4 would thankfully reveal that wasn't the case, but in the moment, you'd be forgiven for thinking it at the time. Some questions raised in the first season of the show would only be answered in the last season, which I'm willing to admit may have contributed to the immense feeling of closure and catharsis I got out of watching it. It's honestly so satisfying to have all these clues and hints pan out and become fully realized in the show, in contrast to so many other shows that weren't at all interested in delivering on the things they hinted at, shows that tie themselves into needless complications in an effort to outsmart the audience, shows that deliberately undercut their own narrative for the sake of surprising the audience, or shows that simply get cancelled and we never get the chance to find out the answers. For a lot of people, it felt like Esmail was deliberately toying with them, and not in a fun way. He'd gone and created one of media's most unreliable narrators, and then teased a dozen different mysteries that its characters were also actively looking to uncover. It was a perfect recipe for compelling storytelling, but instead of providing concrete answers, he buried them under further mysteries and left us with a major cliffhanger ending. It made the characters look like they were wheel spinning, it made the show seem like it didn't have a destination in mind, and it made Esmail look like he was aping the worst aspects of J.J. Abrams' mystery box writing style. So for a lot of people, it just wasn't as enjoyable to speculate about what everything meant. I think it's extremely telling how little literature and analysis there is of the Red Wheelbarrow, even though he's practically begging you to ask what it all means, which is the entire reason I made this video. Meanwhile, you couldn't even try and get through all the think pieces and video essays about the first and last seasons. What I put that down to is that season 2 is just a wee bit too opaque for its own good. Mysteries are extremely compelling stuff, but you can't just be made entirely of mysteries, and you need to provide at least some answers in a timely fashion, or all but the most die-hard Redditors are gonna stop looking for them. That's not to call the other seasons simple by any means. Season 3 does a hell of a job unraveling the knot that its predecessors tied, and the latter half of season 4 is just mind-bending twist after mind-bending twist until the end. But I think it's important to note how much more time and attention was spent on plot and action. I mean, those seasons are relentless. Take the famous season 3 one-shot episode Runtime Error and its follow-up Kill Process, which are pure action taking place over the course of a single afternoon. Episodes 3 through 9 of season 4 all take place on the same day, and then there's the no dialogue episode Proxy Authentication Required. My point is, Mr. Robot became more of an exercise in experimental cinematography, testing the limits of visual storytelling. How well can you make a one-shot episode with multiple locations and action scenes on a TV show's budget? Let's structure and film an episode like a 5-act play. Do you even need characters to speak to tell an effective story? That experimentation was present in season 2 as well. Episodes like Master Slave are jam-packed with creative cinematography, from the 80s sitcom stylings in the first half to what in retrospect feels like a test run of next season's long take in the second half. But I do feel that Esmail started experimenting less and less with text and subtext along the way. When you consider how long it took me to talk about what a red wheelbarrow meant, you start to get a picture of the iceberg that is season 2. Comparatively, the latter 2 seasons state their meaning and intent much more plainly. It's still abstract, sure. I mean, Elliot spends the last 2 episodes in an imaginary mindscape where he's imprisoned the actual Elliot. It's bonkers, but it makes perfect sense if you've been following along, as opposed to the Red Wheelbarrow, which requires stopping for at least a moment to think. If that was intentional, I can't even argue that Esmail was wrong to do that. Complicated doesn't mean good. In fact, an idea communicated simply and straightforwardly can often be more powerful than one buried in layers of obscurity, and he brought home those last 2 seasons better than any TV show ending I've seen since Breaking Bad or The Good Place. But I can't deny I enjoyed this, figuring out the Red Wheelbarrow. There's a kind of satisfaction you get when you figure these things out. It's the same kind of feeling you get when you place the last piece in a puzzle. There's a planned order, an intended way of seeing things, and if you could stick with it and put it all together, you'd be able to see the big picture and everything would finally make sense. Storytelling like this?
I live for this shit.
Thanks for watching me talk about colour for an unreasonable amount of time. Again, I swear I'm done, at least for now. What I do want to talk about now is Patreon. We have one. Would you like to give us money? In exchange for various bits and bobs, of course. All the usual stuff, shoutouts, early videos, and I think I've said this before, but there's always stuff that I cut out of videos because they go off on tangents, or versions of videos that I have to butcher to shit to appease the copyright bot. You can see the full unfucked versions on Patreon, basically. And I'll be doing one of those bonuses for this video, specifically a companion to the colour section. And after this, I swear, this is the last time I'll talk about colour for the foreseeable future. We already appreciate your view, but I and the rest of the UDS gang would be eternally grateful if you were to support us on Patreon as well. Who knows, we get enough of you on board and this could be something I can devote more than just my evenings to. Either way, I'll hopefully see you in the next vid. Bonsoir, viewer.